Okay, so we'll move on to our next speaker. And as I said, if there's time at the end, we can open it for questions to any of the four speakers. So our next speaker is Jim Raymo, who is professor of sociology and the Henry Wendt III Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton. Raymo is a social demographer whose research focuses on understanding the causes and consequences of demographic changes associated with population aging in Japan. His talk today is entitled Mother's Employment, Divorce, and Economic Well-Being, an update on diverging destinies in Japan. Take it away, Jim.
All right. Thank you, Noreen. So this is a different position for me as I've been enjoying organizing the seminars with Noreen. And as she was saying, you know, one of the emphases is to try to provide relatively new faculty with an opportunity to share some of what they've been doing, allow people to get to know them. But as a relatively new faculty member myself, I'm really happy for the opportunity to be able to do that. You know, I realize every week looking at the your little boxes on Zoom, how few of you I've actually had the opportunity to meet. Obviously look forward to that being possible. But in the meantime, I will do what's next best, and that is to share some of my work to give you all, especially students, a sense of what I'm up to and where things are going with the work I'm doing with colleagues and other students. And what I'm going to do is to sort of split my time into two pieces. One, briefly addressing the first part of the title, the substantive focus, which is preliminary work that we're going to present at PAA next month. And then at the end, sort of talking a little bit more about the broader agenda and plans going forward. And that is to articulate some of the ways in which we're going to try to move forward the broad diverging destinies literature. So I don't think I really need, for an OPR audience, to talk much about what diverging destinies is. This is sort of a foundational framework for understanding the intersection of family change and inequality, particularly intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. But so I won't go into that too much, but I'm happy to elaborate later. And at the end, it should be pretty clear what we're thinking about. So let me hang on just a sec. All right, very briefly, a little bit of background. I'd like to start with some data. So here's some data from the OECD. This is a ranking from top to bottom of relative poverty rates among two-parent households in OECD countries. Denmark's the lowest, Israel at the bottom is the highest. What I really want you to pay attention to is the two red lines. This is Japan. So you can see that Japan is sort of a little below average or a little bit higher than average for the OECD, higher than average poverty in two-parent households. But look at the bright red line. That's for single-parent households, almost all of which are single mother households. Over 50% fall below the relative poverty line. Japan is typically the first or the second or the worst, I guess, in terms of single-parent poverty. Poverty for single-parent families and their children. So this is very well known. It's a very important aspect of the inequality landscape in Japan and is part of the motivating focus for this work. This is probably the 10th or 11th paper in a series of work that I've been doing over the years with colleagues in Japan on the well-being of single mothers and their children. Hang on just a sec. Okay, so a little bit more background. Here is information on the educational gradient in divorce. This is just a simple measure of divorce. In the survey we're working with, mothers are asked to report whether or not they've ever divorced. About a quarter of those in the smallest and largest educational group report ever having divorced. It's about a third among the highly educated. So this is well known. We've shown this in other studies as well. The one thing I think I'd like you to take from this is a recognition that Japan is, perhaps contrary to old conventional wisdom, most assuredly not a low divorce country. About a quarter to a third of new marriages are projected to end in divorce in Japan. So this is part of the broader relevance. Here's where our work is kind of new on this. We're trying to address another piece of the conventional wisdom, which is that women's discontinuous employment, a central focus in the Diverging Destinies literature, is part of the explanation for that very high level of poverty among single mothers. To the degree that mothers tend to exit the labor force around first birth, this has implications for post-divorce economic well-being. And what I'm showing you here is a figure from a different survey showing trends in employment trajectories for mothers around first birth. So these are for women who've been married 5 to 9 years and have at least one child age 1 or older. The yellow line is the proportion, the percent who leave the labor force more or less permanently, the homemaker track. And you can see that that has declined pretty markedly in recent years and has been replaced a bit by continuous employment, the orange. But what's really critical here is where Japan does look different from other countries, which is, hang on, this. The dotted line is the combination of the yellow and the orange. That is the percent of mothers who experience discontinuous employment around first birth. It's declined from about 70% to 60%. So this is the modal employment trajectory around first birth, and we're trying to incorporate this into this analysis of mothers' subsequent well-being. So we have several questions we address in the paper for PAA. Very simply put, we're asking how much of the educational gradient, the documented educational gradient in mothers' economic well-being or economic disadvantage, measured in a variety of ways, can be accounted for in a sort of very demographic accounting sense by educational differences in A, divorce, and B, employment trajectories around first birth. And very briefly, we find that, not surprisingly, when we look at mothers as a whole, about a third of the gradient, the educational gradient in economic well-being, poverty, need, ability to save, subjective well-being, is accounted for, again, in an accounting sense, by differences in divorce and economic and employment trajectories. When we limit the focus to ever divorced mothers, so we're going to limit to ever divorced mothers and ask how much of the educational gradient in their disadvantage among this group is accounted for by differences in the employment trajectories, it's about a quarter. So this is, I think, the first time that we have been able to bring some empirical quantification of the role of differences in employment trajectories in terms of our ability to understand the educational gradient and various measures of well-being. Note we're measuring economic well-being at the maternal level or the household level with the assumption that this has obvious implications, ramifications for children's resources, which of course is the main focus of the Diverging Destinies literature more broadly. So I said that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about agenda as well. I've got about 2 minutes left. So what we'd like to do is to try to address what we perceive as some limitations in the Diverging Destinies literature. This is foundational literature. It's one of those, the work of Sarah and her colleagues, Sarah McClanahan and her colleagues, has sort of been a foundation for the work that I've been doing over the past several years. But we recognize that there are many ways in which we can move this literature forward, and this is a list of 6 of them. The first is to recognize that little attention has been paid to these questions outside of the US, Western Europe, and the English-speaking countries. And I'd be happy to talk about some of the strong reasons that we would expect Diverging Destinies to be very relevant in the East Asian context, not just Japan, but East Asia more broadly, and several of the reasons why we might expect it to be of very little relevance in these contexts as well. One thing we tried to do today was to focus on both divorce and employment trajectories in conjunction with each other, which I think moves us beyond the tendency to focus on single individual family transitions or family behaviors in isolation, and to think about socioeconomic differences in packages of family behavior and the ways in which those packages of family behavior may be related to family well-being and the resources available to children. We focused here in these preliminary results on compositional differences. And I think this is a main sort of thrust in the Diverging Destinies literature. You go back to Sarah McClanahan's original articulation, it's really focusing on composition. But we think that there are a lot of good reasons to think not just about composition, but also about returns. That is the extent to which the bifurcation in family behavior may be accompanied by a growing divergence in the association between those family behaviors and economic well-being. Next, little attention to variation in the experience of the event. So rather than focusing on employed or not, we're trying to focus on employment type, non-standard employment versus regular employment, and so on. And the last two, very briefly, not a lot of attention to other factors that may be related to SES and well-being, particularly things like intergenerational co-residence and intergenerational transfers of support that are particularly relevant in the East Asian context. And then finally, a focus on life course, the life course of Diverging Destinies. So I realize I'm at 10 minutes, so I'll stop there and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing like having a co-seminar organizer being very attentive to the time.
Of course.
So thank you. Let me take a question. By the way, not all of these questions have to have the student start first, in which case only a student can get their question in. So put in the chat, anybody a question for Jim? Okay, anyone?
I explained everything so well that there's nothing to ask about. No, I know that's not true.
Well, Zoe has a question.
Hey, Jim, it would be great if you can elaborate more on what are the reasons that you find Diverging Destinies may not be relevant in East Asian context.
Great. So I actually have a slide on that. Here, hang on. So these are a few reasons that we think that the notion of Diverging Destinies may be of less relevance in Japan and East Asia more generally. So this is one place in the world, there are many obviously, but in the low fertility world where the family life course has been characterized by a high degree of homogeneity, very limited evidence in the past of socioeconomic differences in likelihood of marrying, timing of marriage, and so on. Another factor is the near absence of non-marital childbearing. In Korea and Japan, the percent of children born to unmarried mothers is 2%. It's doubled, but from 1% to 2%. So it's essentially not there. This, of course, is a central focus along with multi-partner fertility, which also is largely irrelevant in the East Asian context. And these are sort of central to the Diverging Destinies literature. A widely shared emphasis on mother's role in children's success. So this is another reason to think that there may be relatively little socioeconomic variation in things like mothers' employment trajectories and so on. Strong emphasis on intergenerational support. About 30% of divorced mothers go back to live with their parents. And we've demonstrated that this has real implications for their well-being. So that to the degree that this sort of offsets some of the socioeconomic disparities that are generated by family behavior differentials, this may be relevant. A long response, but some of the other things that we think may be reasons to think that Diverging Destinies is very relevant in Japan is the same kinds of changes that have happened in the United States with respect to rise in divorce, single parenthood, changes in maternal employment trajectories, growing child poverty, and so on. So really a range of reasons on both hands. Great,
thank you. Okay, so our final speaker is Pat Sharkey, Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs. His research focuses on urban inequality, violence, and crime in the US and social policies. His talk today is entitled Divided, How America Learned to Avoid Its Greatest Challenges. The floor is yours, Pat.
Thanks, Noreen. Just let me know if the slides are not advancing, if there are any issues. Thanks, and thanks for organizing this. This is great. This is a really a cool idea, and it takes advantage of Zoom. I really like it. So as you can see, this is I thought since I have 10 minutes, I thought I'd give an overview of kind of a set of interrelated projects and the ideas driving this research agenda. And I'm doing this with a bunch of people, including a bunch of PhD students here at Princeton and a couple at NYU. And this is very early stage. So input on the core ideas is welcome here. I promise this is not a talk about COVID. Did the slide advance, by the way? That worked?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so this is not a talk about COVID, but it's a project that is focused on big collective challenges. And I think this graph is a pretty good reminder that the US is not great at solving big collective challenges that require large-scale mobilization and investment. And so starting here is a reminder, but once we get past the coronavirus, we'll be reminded that this is not anomalous. So there are a whole bunch of grand challenges facing the US that require some form of collective mobilization and investment. As our colleagues in econ have pointed out, deaths of despair have risen sharply. Upward mobilities, which used to be automatic, at least in absolute terms, has been falling since the cohort born in the 1940s. Income inequality keeps rising. Racial and ethnic wealth gaps haven't narrowed. Mass shootings have become, with the pause of last year, for some reason, mass shootings have become more frequent and more deadly. Police killings haven't fallen after years of very close scrutiny and large-scale social movement. That hasn't changed. Police killings haven't dropped at all. And then we have the issue of climate change waiting, which again has not been resolved. So you might disagree that some of these are urgent problems or crises, or you might have other problems that you nominate. So the specific problems are not the point. The larger point is about why we have trouble, or at least the direction I'm heading is about why we have trouble in the US responding to large-scale challenges that require some form of collective mobilization. And the argument that I'm just beginning to kind of lay out, I'll make it in 4 points. The first is that as trust in the government has fallen, we've stopped trying to solve many of our most pressing problems with collective mobilization and investment. And this decline in trust in the federal government, I think, is a empirical fact, at least if you trust the public opinion data, that I think doesn't get enough attention in current debates about social policy. It used to be that the vast majority of Americans said they trusted the federal government, and that has declined since the Obama years to about 20% or lower. Secondly, instead of responding to these grand challenges with mobilization and investment, the US has responded by giving groups of Americans ways to avoid them. So much of American social policy is driven by the goal of separation. This is not a novel insight, but it's really kind of going back to the observation in American apartheid that segregation is the linchpin, not just of racial inequality, but I'm arguing that it's really, it has provided another approach to dealing with grand challenges by giving segments of the population a way to avoid those challenges. The mechanism, and this is where the project starts to drift into the empirical phase, the most common mechanism to create a pathway to avoid big challenges, I'm arguing, is to create what I'm calling barricades in space. Spatial barricades are informal or formal boundaries that divide and regulate the use of space. And so I'll run through a couple examples. There's some classic examples where there's been lots of research. So these are the old Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. This one's of Atlanta from 1938. The first paper from this project focused on the long-term impact of red and yellow lined boundaries and the impact on income mobility decades later. So this is one initial example of what I have in mind when I'm talking about barricades. That means literal efforts to divide space, either formally or informally, and that division then creates a mechanism for separation, for the hoarding of resources, and for the exclusion of segments of the population. This continues with the interstate highway system. So this is one of the major data sources that I'm working with now. And then more modern versions of this are found in places like Sandy Springs, Georgia, where which is a reflection of two kinds of barricades. One, Sandy Springs itself formed as an incorporated city explicitly in order to separate itself from Atlanta to the south and separate the population, which is relatively affluent, which was almost entirely white, from the city of Atlanta, which was going through fiscal crisis. But secondly, 85% of the area within Sandy Springs is zoned for detached single-family homes. Okay, so these are two forms of barricades. One, formation of a new city. Secondly, the regulation of land use in a way that generates exclusion. So this, when I said this was part of a larger research project, that project is proceeding by collecting national data on a whole range of what I'm calling spatial barricades, beginning with those Homeowners Loan Corporation maps and continuing with a national database of every land parcel across the country and the land use regulations that go with it. Business improvement districts, water and sewer districts, and so forth. Okay, very quickly, the empirical part of the project stems from this fourth point. So I'm arguing that the mechanism for separation is through the construction of spatial barricades. And the empirical argument is that our national reliance on barricades has had three major consequences. First, barricades facilitate segregation and concentrate disadvantaged groups and social problems in space. And here, this is a point that already has a ton of research that we're kind of building from. I do want to just add that we are, in addition to just looking at segregation, we're looking at the spatial compression of different segments of the population. And one kind of core finding to begin with is that low income segments of the population have become more compressed, consolidated in space, whereas more affluent, since 1970, whereas more affluent groups have expanded their presence over time. Barricades amplify inequality. So this is a set of projects looking at income mobility specifically and kind of using the boundaries of barricades to try to make a causal case about the impact on income mobility. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, barricades reduce the chances for collective mobilization and problem solving. And so here, I'm looking at the relationship between various forms of barricades and a group of collective outcomes. I'm arguing that barricades help divide people by political affiliation, that they make collective problems like greenhouse gas emissions much worse, in addition to commuting times and other kind of collective challenges, that they erode civic and institutional engagement, and that they affect collective-oriented behavior, like, for instance, we're using data on mask usage during the coronavirus. So this all leaves us with a central question that I have not answered, but we're getting some interesting answers from the Biden administration here. In a spatially divided country, how do we bring people together to solve collective challenges? This is kind of the grand question that's motivating a lot of this analysis. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.